From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Hi, welcome to another edition of Chicago Newsroom right here on Can TV. I'm Ken Davis, and we're happy to be with you for another week to talk about all the things that matter in the city of Chicago. And today we're going to be talking about 215, because that's the most important political number in Chicago right now. It's how much money the Chicago Public Schools thought they'd be getting from the state in a deal they thought they struck last fall. But as you know, the money never came, and the school system was in the very embarrassing position of having to put that money into its budget for this year. So that gaping hole in the budget has triggered some new numbers like 13 and 3, as in ending the school year 13 days or 3 weeks early. But Mayor Emanuel says, don't worry, it ain't going to happen. He's assured us it's not going to happen. So where's he going to get all that money? Well, it's a perplexing question, and when you're perplexed, the place to turn is the Chicago Association of People Who Make a Living Writing About Education. And 3 of our favorites are right here at the table today. We haven't seen some of you for a long time because you've been so busy writing, but Lauren FitzPatrick from the Chicago Sun-Times, great to have you back again. Sarah Karp from WBEZ, and also from WBEZ, Becky Vevea. So really happy to have you guys here today. Just before we begin, absolutely not connected to anything at all, I saw this picture today in the Sun-Times, and I was listening to your radio station coming to work this morning as they were talking about the big unveiling yesterday. And I thought, you know, the problem with these Obamas is they have no sense of humor. What I would have done is, you have this whole big thing and you drop the curtain, and there's a model of the big mushroom. You know? This is what we're going to do in Jackson Park. But no, we're just kidding, folks. Actually, that's not what we're going to build. We're not going to build the Lucas Museum. It would be funny. It would have been very funny. Anyway, hi, welcome to Chicago Newsroom. So, $215 million. It seems to me that this must be white knuckles time for Forrest Claypool and for the mayor. But I guess the first question I really want to throw out here is, didn't they know they weren't going to get this money? I mean, it seemed like we were all talking. We've been talking for months and months and months about this, right? Didn't they know this wasn't going to happen? Explain.
I mean, they must have thought that, I think they were willing to bank on the chance that the money would come through for a couple of reasons. One is they built last year's budget on a wish and a prayer and a $450 million hole. Mm-hmm. And it took a lot of getting, but they got it in the end, you know, after cuts and layoffs and stuff had gone through, but in the end, they got it. And then their alternative would have been, and I remember grilling them, we all grilled them about, how can you say this budget is balanced when you don't have this $215 million in hand? But the alternative was they would have had to build the budget without it at the beginning of the school year. And $250 million pays for a lot of teachers, a lot of programs, a lot of things that make school wonderful places to go. I mean, that goes toward like a quality education for kids. So, I mean, maybe they were playing chicken all along, but that would have been tough to swallow at the beginning of the year, and they would have had to have eaten it themselves. It would have been on them. And now they've got a bad guy in Rauner and the state.
Sounds about right to me. Yeah, I mean, again, last year, the whole hope and a prayer thing ultimately ended up working out for them. And so I think that their thinking was, if we put this in there, it becomes sort of a pressure point. Now they can't back away unless they want to be the bad guy and sign the veto. And that's what happened. And of course, it set off this whole other series of events of mid-year budget cuts again, and this lawsuit that got filed in February. So.
And I guess what I'm hearing you saying is that sometimes playing chicken can work to your advantage, because if you lose, you still have a bad guy to point to that you might not have had otherwise, right? So is Rauner really wearing the jacket for this at this point? Is this the way they envisioned it?
You know, I'm not so sure. I mean, I certainly they've done a very big PR, push. All parents have gotten letters in their bag saying, Rauner's bad person. And they've been all over the news, and he's racist, and he's this, and he's that. But at the same time, most of the parents I talk to feel like right now they were in the middle of a big game, and their children were the pawns, and they are not happy, and they're mad at Claypool. I mean, yes, they're mad at Rauner, but Rauner just seems like generally he's just, he's not doing anything. So, what is happening with the politicians that you look right up to? And I feel like a lot of people are saying, like, what the hell just happened? So we went through this whole song and dance, and now they're like, forget it. We don't have to. We actually aren't going to cancel the school year. It's like, what is going on here?
I was thinking about this morning, and I just remembered that there's like this one big thing that I can't remember from last fall. The game of chicken was that they got legislation passed saying that the state would give CPS $215 million. But there was this little comma, right? Comma, as long as there is pension reform, whatever the heck that means.
And that was part of the problem too. It was this quote unquote pension reform, which no one was ever able to articulate, like what were they actually supposed to accomplish. So even if you were a parent who wanted to make calls or write letters or go to Springfield, as CPS has been encouraging them to do, like, what in the world were you encouraging? What were you standing up for? There was no bill. There was no specific language. It was just, hey, we need pension reform.
But what happened technically was that Rauner vetoed that legislation, right? He actually vetoed it.
Yes.
Why weren't they able to override the veto? I don't know if anybody remembers this. This is just something that just hit me this morning. It's like, why didn't they do that? Why wasn't that overridden?
Well, there's a political disagreement. I mean, first of all, Rauner didn't just come up with this idea of pension reform. I mean, this was like the whole thing was predicated on pension reform. And I mean, the whole pension changes are very hard to get through. And so I think that it was just a political, Cullerton has his own agenda, and Madigan has his own agenda, and Rauner has his own agenda. And I don't think anybody's ready to stand up and say, okay, we're going to do this. So and actually I remember at the press conference where we learned that they were putting $215 million in the budget, and all of us said, like, you're really trusting these guys? Are you sure? I mean, he must have taken like, 8-9 questions. I mean, bond buyer was asking, we were asking, everybody was like, this is not a good idea, guys, I mean, this politics just got in the way. I mean,
but as Lauren says, ultimately, when you're faced with these stark situations, maybe this was the best hand they had to play. Was just put it in the budget and just let it play out. I don't know, but I mean, now we're talking about. As I said, there's like, 13 days and 3 weeks or something. That, by the way, what are the dates of that? Does anybody know?
June 20th is the last day of school.
That's the last day of school.
And there was discussion about ending school on June 1st, and that was part of the lawsuit filings that the district filed when they sued the state. They said irreparable harm would be that they would have to end school on June 1st. They listed canceling summer school and a litany of other things that they defined as irreparable harm, and needing this injunction, which even if the judge had granted an injunction, the district, there wasn't going to be a windfall of cash the next day. The judge cannot allocate money. He cannot force the legislature to allocate money. It would have gone to the legislature to determine how to comply with that ruling. Well, of course, that whole lawsuit got thrown out, as we know. But the dates are, June 20th is the actual last day of school, and it sounds like they're going to go all the way till June 20th, according to the mayor.
June 20th?
June 20th.
June 20th. So then that's the situation that he's going to. They have to figure out money to get this, because in addition to filling up the empty days, they also have this $60 million thing we've just been talking about the last few days, where if they don't provide these days of education, then the state penalizes them. So that there'd be $60 million even further in the hole if they didn't provide these days.
And that would go towards next year. They would lose that money in the following year because they would not have complied with the minimum number of instructional days as required by the school code. And all of that, I guess, at this point is kind of again, moot because the lawsuit was thrown out and the mayor has now pledged that the schools will remain in session until June 20th. I will say, just to remind people that 215 was the number, but there were mid-year cuts. So right now they're looking to plug a gap of 130.
Oh, so really 130 is the number right now.
Is sort of the number, though we aren't entirely sure what does CPS actually have in cash on hand and what is the difference between those two numbers. It's this weird, funny math problem that we're all trying to figure out with quite a few missing numbers.
I just can't imagine Rom was ever going to let the school year be cut by that many days.
Not on his
if
watch.
any days at all. If any at all. Maybe, I don't know, maybe the last couple, what's the 20th, like a Tuesday?
It's a Tuesday, yeah, so they could have chopped off that last week or something.
But I mean, he stands so tall and proud about his longer school day and longer school year. I mean, which then just makes me angry. I can't imagine how angry parents are who felt like they were caught in the middle of like, the city made this threat that they never intended to make good on, and it threw a lot of people into a tizzy about what the heck you're going to do with your kids for 3 whole weeks.
I agree that there was just no way they were ever going to do this. I mean, that's part of what I think makes people really cynical about all of this is that you see these news releases and you see these earnest press events with everybody standing at the podium, and you know that everybody's just basically lying through their teeth. There's no way they're going to do the thing that they're arguing about.
And my question is, like, could they have brought that lawsuit without making that the irreparable harm? Because they had to make a case of why should the judge fast track this, right? I mean, this is the whole pension problem, the disparity has been around for like hundreds of years. So why do we need a judge to decide today, right? I mean, so they had to make some argument, and I guess that in a way, legally, maybe that was the only thing that they could say that might have fast tracked the judge to make a decision quickly. But then again, it did. We have a big exodus of people away from Chicago. A lot of a big enrollment drop in Chicago public schools, and you gotta think that year after year of like, oh, school's not going to start on time, school's not going to end on time, school's this, school's that, there's strikes. That this is driving a lot of the push of people out of the city, and I think that at some point, Mayor Emanuel might think again about some of these threats, because I think it is. I hear parents say, "I'm getting up. I'm leaving. I'm not doing this again to my kid."
Parents like, say, Wendy Catton.
Right. Like an advocate who pushed for quality schools.
Right. Who spent the whole many years working for that, and then they decided to move to Evanston.
Her son's entire grade school,
Right.
Tenure, she
Right.
was on the front lines of volunteering and championing the things CPS did well, and then criticizing where she thought there were problems. And I mean, she said she gave other reasons for why it was time for her family to go too, but you have to imagine, like, she just was not going to go through this for another 4 years of high school.
If nothing else, it's just incredibly symbolic. I mean, somebody who's so iconic in the school reform movement to just walk away. So the question that we're faced with right now is, where will they get this money, however much it is? Now, those of us who are older and have been around for a while get a little cynical about this because
129
million. I mean, that's pocket change. I mean, come on.
It's probably 29 point something.
That's nothing. All right, I'll list it for you. We'll take $45 million out of the central office by firing unnecessary bureaucrats. We do that every time. We will defer some maintenance. We'll defer some construction.
We'll turn off the lights at night.
We'll turn off the lights at night.
Cancel all the
Exactly.
magazine subscriptions.
Oh, those damn magazine subscriptions.
That's got to be at least $12 million.
Right, and before you know it,
on.
there's $130 million. I mean, it happens every year. George Schmidt is my favorite guy when we're talking about that. He's been documenting it for like something like 30 years. There's like $17 billion have been saved by reducing the central office staff.
There's nobody there. It's all run by robots.
That's right. So, I mean, should we be really concerned about this $130 million? They're going to find it somehow, right?
So I think that the one thing, and it is such a small number, and it also boils down to what they have in their hands to pay to the pension fund on
Yes,
June 30th.
right.
This isn't about, I think a lot of people, it's about keeping school open or paying the teachers.
Right.
No, actually it's about paying a bill that's
Yes.
due at the end of the month.
What's that, 721?
721 is their portion of, the 733 or something.
$721 million. Now that's real money.
Right. And so they've got, 600 of it, and so it's just a matter of we gotta look under the couch cushions or figure out some credit we can take out, and this is where the whole borrowing question comes in again, and short-term borrowing, and can they bridge the gap to give the fund the cash it needs on time that it's supposed to pay it without any penalties or interest. And I know that's not very sexy for people, but that's really what this boils down to. And so I think people should also brace themselves for when they explain how they're coming up with this money, it's going to be kind of convoluted and complicated. And we're all going to have the challenge of trying to communicate to the public what couch cushion they found this under. And I think, there could be the role that the pension fund, the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund, and their board will play in some of this could end up entering the equation as well. So 2 years ago, if you remember, that they floated this idea that they wouldn't make the full payment on time. That would obviously there's some weirdness, and the board of the pension fund would certainly have to weigh in on that and figure out what sort of action they would take, because then that could trigger their right to sue the district for
as required by law.
As required, yes, because they'd be missing a payment as required by law. So I think there's also going to be some conversation like there was 2 years ago about, what role, what does the pension fund say to the district handing them 600 with an IOU?
Well, what they've already said is that would be like telling the teachers that we're going to pay you with your pension check from 30 years from now or something, right?
Right. I'm not recommending it. I'm just saying people should be prepared for that conversation to begin or to be ramping up very soon, because I anticipate the district is in conversations with the pension fund board at this point about what amount they have and what amount they can make in that payment on June 30th.
And then there's the spare change that's in the school accounts, and every year at the end of the year, principals have a little money here and there, and usually by beginning of June, you're not supposed to do any more spending for the current school year. They moved it up this year to May 1st.
Principals all got locked out of spending on May 1st, so they're bracing for a big sweep of those accounts.
The principals who weren't smart enough to spend it.
At this point, I think it's going to be less now than it was in the past years, because most principals are smart enough to spend their money. They're not sitting on money anymore.
This is actually a test of how clever your principal is.
I am telling you, they were a little surprised. I'm sure we all heard from some principals who are like, oh, damn, that extra, $5,000 that's sitting there. I forgot to spend it. But I think most people, try to get it out of their account. So.
Which is funny, because a couple years ago, you wanted to be squirreling away as much money as possible, so that when CPS took your teachers, you had some money to keep your staff in place. Except this year, if you had money in place, then they came in and vacuumed half of it up.
So they're going to get you either way, aren't they?
It seems like it. It seems like it.
So do you have any idea how much money is in this little squirrely fund?
And I've started to ask. I've been asking all week to get a sense of it. I heard at some point a smart principal guessed maybe as much as $30 million.
Wow.
But who knows?
Wow, $30 million just kind of sloshing around in the schools.
And maybe that's what's been there in the past. But again, everybody wised up after February when their discretionary spending was frozen, and maybe they all made it disappear.
Well, when they did the mid-year cuts, they looked at that spreadsheet that they had where they could see what was in everybody's account, and they said, we're taking half of it.
Right.
So either principals had to get busy spending, or the district's about to take the other half of it, I think is really, there's ways you could estimate based on what was in there in the middle of the year, but there were schools, Lane Tech, I think, had $1 million swept out of its account, meaning it probably had $2 million in it, so unless they spent another $1 million the last 3 months, there's probably a chunk of change under a lot of schools that were.
And I think this was left in the personnel files too. So if you budgeted so much for a teacher who left or cost a little bit less than you thought you were going to have to spend, then maybe there are other little bits of money. And now when we're counting nickels and dimes,
Well, of course, the big conversation has been about the mayor swooping in and saying, I won't let this happen, which means that maybe he's got a few couches of his own that he can look under seat cushions, and that great big TIF couch is big and fluffy and plump. So maybe there's a bunch of TIF money that's going to have to start to flow into this.
Except the phrase my colleague Fran Spielman used was like a bridge loan from TIF. So
I saw that, yeah.
Which like,
What does that mean then?
he's
Do
not
you
just
pay
like
interest
the
back to the
check
TIF
is
account?
not just getting cut. Like if the check gets cut, it looks like it's going to come with a payment plan, which is just pushing this farther and farther down
And
the
that's
road.
the thing. Next year, I do not think that Forrest Claypool can stand in front of us and say, I'm banking on the state to give us a couple hundred more $1 million than we actually have in hand. So I think next year, they're going to have to, at least to me, they're going to have to like really actually cut, where they've been like, okay, we're holding student per pupil funding, stagnant. I think they're going to have to really dig in.
Sarah, how many years have you written the lead? It's over for this year, but next year is going to be the worst ever.
Year, oh my God. It's so sad.
They balanced the books this year, but next year.
And I mean, the last 2 years, it's like they actually haven't balanced the books. They actually haven't.
Yeah.
And so, and they're predicting a huge budget deficit for the future. So, you do start to wonder how low can you go?
Right.
Or maybe eventually, Rahm Emanuel will look at other revenue options to increase some money coming into Chicago Public Schools. Maybe the state legislature will get their act together and change the whole funding formula. That will maybe.
So I mean, what I'm
maybe.
The sense that I'm getting is that I don't think any of you are saying that CPS is being grossly mismanaged at this point. CPS is just simply reeling along, reacting to all of the external forces that are on it, and that it simply doesn't have enough money to run a big school system. Is that a fair statement? Ooh, quiet, silence.
Big picture, it doesn't have enough money to run the school system. I still have lots of questions about the way that they're spending the money that they do have.
And it's not entirely like someone else's fault. So, it's about debt. We have a lot of debt. It's eating up a lot of the money that comes in the door. We have, a lot of things that are like historical that we've now we're paying the piper. So it's not, it's not like, okay, it's everybody else's fault, but at the same time, we also have a drop in enrollment, and that is hurting our budget. That's hurting Chicago Public Schools' budget. And so there's like this, this double whammy. We still have the same, we still have these huge debt payments. We still have this, we still have that, and we're losing money because we're losing students. So it does make a very difficult budget picture.
Yeah, it's not easy.
And then they're still adding schools.
Right. Don't forget that.
Charters
are
are
more schools.
Charters are a lot, but then the Diet High School reopened,
right.
and it's beautiful, and those programs are fabulous. But now that's another school with added capacity, and there are 11,000 fewer kids in the district than the last year.
If I recall, though, that a couple of years ago, didn't we pass legislation where there's a separate taxing line for construction and
school
maintenance,
construction,
right?
And we're spending it on a lot of schools that
we're building schools. We're
building a lot of schools.
So, I remember thinking at the time, that'll last a year or two, and then they'll figure out a way to suck that money into the operating budget, because that's the way it always works.
Well, they've been very clear that they're not going to let that happen, and that's partly, it's frustrating for parents. I talked to some families down in the South Loop. There's a big controversy over the new building being built for the South Loop School, because there are schools just down the road with space for students, National Teachers Academy, and if you even go further into Bronzeville. Now, again, we then get into questions about race and class segregation in the city, but the district has been very clear that is a separate levy, that has to go only to school construction. We cannot use it for operations. We cannot use it to plug this $130 million hole. So, they seem pretty adamant that they're going to leave that alone, but I do think there's also big questions, like Lauren and Sarah mentioned, about the district is shrinking. It's constricting. It's becoming smaller, and they need to figure out a way to manage. You would think logically, as you get smaller, your budget shouldn't continue to grow. Right. And I think last year was the first year you saw actually like went down from $6 billion to 5.8 billion or something. You know, it like went down by a couple hundred million. And I think that managing that is not a politically fun thing for anyone to do, but it goes back to school closings. The moratorium is going to be lifting. Yeah. We closed 50 schools in 2013.
Right. That was
that was 5 years ago, and they said we're not going to close schools for 5 years. Well, it's been 5 years. I think there's going to be that question coming up too about how much do we need?
And they're
how
going to
many
gun
buildings?
for high schools. Those high schools are
those
going
high
away.
schools.
As you guys have all written so brilliantly, the neighborhood high schools are just dying on the vine. But yet we're spending $50 million at a pop to build new high schools or proposing new high schools. And I think some people are rightly saying, why are we doing this? Why are we spending this huge amount of money building new infrastructure when the infrastructure we have is creaky and we probably don't need as many seats as we have? And of course, as you guys have written, and congratulations, by the way, the education writers have cited you for this, and you got a big award for writing about the fact that this really comes down to a segregation issue. That we're spending all this money on schools, and we're not only not improving the segregation issue, we're actually exacerbating the segregation issue in some ways when all this stuff is done.
Right. And I mean, you know, to the defense of, I mean, I guess one way that you could defend it is that there are some schools that are very overcrowded, right? I mean, and you want to keep those people in Chicago. I mean, you know, you don't want to create an incentive for them to leave. But, you know, I just wonder if there might be some way for the Chicago Public Schools to think creatively and see if you could lure some people who are in an overcrowded school to an underutilized school. Yeah. You know, if there's ways that you could, I mean, you know, Arnie Duncan was very cute when he like sort of changed the names, like franchised the names of schools. You know, you have Disney 1 and now you got Disney 2. Yeah. And maybe you know, you could go from you know, the highly sought after Saginaw to Saginaw 2 or whatever. I mean, maybe
Lane South.
Well, that's what they're doing. And maybe perhaps our Taft, the North Taft campus
North,
or something like that. Yeah. And so, I mean, maybe you could do that, and then maybe you could, you know, at least try to get the utilization right.
Take some of the citywide programs, take some of the gifted programs, and put them into schools. Right. Programs that draw, and put them into schools that have a lot of room and could use the boost. And then you free up space in the schools where they used to be, as well.
Well, I think my sense of it is that, you know, back in the halcyon days when Mayor Daley took over, and they had a lot of money because they were taking it out of the pension fund. But we digress. You know, there was a big boom of building schools, and they built some beautiful schools, and those schools are doing very well, largely speaking, because people like to be in them, and it has a good feel to them. So there's definitely something to be said for improving the infrastructure, and you know, people appreciate that.
And many of those schools were desegregation schools under the consent decree that we were under, and they are great schools. And you know, I think it was money well spent. We are still paying some of those off. That adds to the debt load. You know, people talk about the ballooning pension payments being over $700 million. I mean, our debt payments, this year was $676 million or something like that. It was over $600 million.
That's largely for construction, I suppose.
It's a construction, and the Trib has written a lot about the sort of the borrowing that was done under Daley, and some of it went to construction, much of it did, but a lot of it also went to strange operations and new textbooks and computers that never got opened, and sort of. So I don't think you're seeing as much of that happening these days. You know, people ordering stuff that then doesn't get used.
Yeah. Can we stir into this mix, this thing about the new high school application process? I know you guys have written about that.
Speaking of enrollment,
that is. I have this feeling that it's earth-shattering, that it's something really, really big, that 10 years from now we'll look back on that moment and say, this was when CPS really did a huge thing that is either really good or really bad, I don't know, but it's a kind of a dividing line. There was the day before and the day after. Explain,
This
please.
is total choice. It's a choice system, and it's totally, I mean, yes, they're keeping neighborhood high schools, but everybody applying means that we're going into total choice for our high school system.
Let's start at the beginning. What is this thing?
It is an application that all 8th graders will fill out, every single one of them. Right now, only you elect to do it, and many have criticized that draws the most motivated families, the wealthiest, most affluent people who can take the time to go visit schools and make all these submit all these applications. Now, every 8th grader will have to do it. They will rank at somewhere between 1 and 8, I think, 8 schools, 1 through 8, and they will plug that into an algorithm, and every kid will get a match.
Oh, not an algorithm.
It's it's a little bit like the best way that I've gotten it described to me by the people who designed it, and the people who designed it have history designing residency matches for doctors.
Okay.
So it's a lot like that, and you go in, you get a match. Very few kids would not end up with a match, but there is a possibility that some might end up without a match. But everybody would get a match, and then you can accept that match, or you can enter it again and get a second match. If you reject both of your matches, then you go to the school your address is assigned to, so your neighborhood high school. In some ways that could help some neighborhood high schools. I think the very interesting piece about it, and I actually agree that it will be big, and when we talk about efficiency and what we need in this district and how many schools should we have, there will be a data set to tell us what schools kids ranked what numbers.
Yes, yeah.
And we will be able to see, hopefully the public will, but the district at the very least will be able to see, schools that might be surprises that, we had a lot of people rank this one number 2. Maybe there's something going on there that we should check out and try to replicate.
And my understanding is you're not even necessarily applying to just the whole school. You're applying to maybe special programs that are within the school. So there might be a school that overall on the whole doesn't seem to be impressive by its numbers, but they've got something special going on inside that building that has amazing graduation rates, that's doing spectacular things with its kids. So, I think that's where the surprises are going to pop out, these little program within the building
Of course,
situations.
the danger is, like what principals are worried about is, what if nobody picks you?
Well,
what if you're nobody's match? Then
what if you're, I'm not picking on, but Manly High School or something like that. These high schools that we've talked about that are just collapsing.
Look, even with the you're still neighborhood schools, only like 50 kids are there now.
Right.
And if those 50 kids had filled out an application, would they be there? And so I think this might be actually, it might get around like closing a school because kids might close it themselves.
I was just going to say, so maybe this is, I don't know, Darwinism or something, right? Maybe they're creating a system where they don't have to close these schools, the public will close them for them.
The other side of this that, Janice Jackson, the chief education officer, says, well, this is going to be great because everybody will choose their school, so they'll have ownership, they'll be happy to be there, and that kids do better. But what if you're that poor child? And this happens in New York. New York has a very similar system to this, who you put down 8 choices, and your letter says, you have no matches. That's got to be a devastating feeling. Not just that you didn't get into the top school in Chicago, but you wrote 8 places and you aren't in any of them. That's very sad.
Yeah.
Could that happen?
Oh yeah, it happens in New York. They have this fair after like the whole matching. It's like the school fair for the unmatched.
That's awful.
Where there are still spaces.
And I think there's certainly going to be kinks because there will be kinks because people will, what happens if you move here and you weren't, there's going to have to be, and I'm sure the district, is thinking through some of this, like, God, I hope they are. But yeah, you're going to have unmatched kids. You're going to have kids still showing up on the first day, being like, well, where do I go?
And you've written, I know that there's a question about charters, right? The charters aren't necessarily...
Well, not all of them are in right now. Not all of them are in right now. Several have volunteered and said, great, we're in. And the issue with the charters is each charter chain has a different application process. They frequently have different deadlines. With some, multi-campus operators, you have to apply to each campus that you're interested in. I mean, if you're talking about a choice between a district-run school and a charter, that's a ton of work and a lot of details to keep track of. So, of the charters that have agreed to be in, and no one will say who they are yet, that'll make life easier for kids and parents because now you're talking about one deadline and one place to go to fill out all of your papers to get in. Now, Janice Jackson has said she's going to work with the willing first, the Coalition of the Willing, and then she's going to sweet talk a little bit, and then ultimately it sounds like she wants to use the charter's renewal process to coerce any stragglers to join this so that, I mean, how many years could that be? Within the next 4 or 5 years at the most, it sounds like everyone will be in.
That's Lauren FitzPatrick, for those of you listening to us on SoundCloud or listening to us on iTunes. She's with the Chicago Sun-Times. Sarah Karp is also here from WBEZ, and Becky Vevea also here from WBEZ. And you're listening to Chicago Newsroom, which you can see on TV, of course, like you're watching it on TV. It gets so confusing sometimes because, we're on Facebook and I don't know, everything. We're multimedia. Which you have to be. So Betsy DeVos starts to figure in here at some place, doesn't she? Because if she has her way, you're going to eventually get all the Catholic high schools in there too, because you'll get your voucher and you can go to St. somebody.
This is ground where, I'm just going to say it. I think that she is so extreme in her belief in choice that this is where the district and the charters have common ground.
Yeah.
So
interesting.
I don't know that I necessarily see this happening in Chicago anytime soon, because really, if you think about the families that would grab at vouchers in Chicago, I have to think the first ones are dedicated, proud charter parents. And then what happens to the charter schools? So I think there's room here.
Wow, I never thought about it.
I think there's room for the charters and the neighborhood school supporters to sort of band together and keep vouchers from happening here.
So those of us who've been so questioning of charters all along, it's suddenly then charters are kind of like on the public school side of the equation.
Now they're public schools.
And now they really are public
right.
schools.
Now they're going to wear that banner, yeah.
I mean, I don't know I don't know much about the enrollment in the Catholic school system anymore, but I mean, where I grew up in Humboldt Park, I was the only kid on my block, and there were lots of kids on my block who went to public school. Virtually everybody else was in the Catholic schools, and the parents just worked like dogs to raise the money to, because this quality of schools issue was around in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and 80s, just like it is now. But I mean, if that happened and Chicago parents had the option of sending their kids to a Catholic or private school and the government would pay for it?
Well, they'll pay for some of it.
Or some of
it.
However, I mean,
And the Archdiocese has also closed schools in the last 5, 6, 7 years. And I think that it can be a bit of a hype in some ways. Yeah. Because I think that people also don't realize that vouchers it's not like they're covering lab school tuition. Okay. They're not.
Can't go to Francis Parker on this thing.
No, and even Archdiocese tuition, depending on which school you're picking, I mean, we have yet to see what the federal government decides to do on this part of things. I mean, we have yet to see if they move forward on it and what the amount ends up being, if there is an amount.
So potentially these vouchers or opportunity scholarships, or however it is that they would be called, could potentially end up benefiting middle and upper middle class families more than poor families, because they can write a check for the difference.
For the remainder.
Right.
And there are lots of families who can't.
Right. Mm-hmm. The other thing that can happen, which when I was a reporter up in Milwaukee, they had one of the first the first voucher program in America. And when I was there, a lot of what I covered, the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction had just started to regulate them more. And there were a lot of voucher schools that were shutting down because they were just 98% voucher students taking the voucher money, but they were not, they weren't providing milk at lunchtime. They became almost pop-up shop schools where they opened because they saw the opportunity in the money being provided by this program.
Sounds like a lot of the private colleges.
And many of the schools, the successful schools in Milwaukee that take voucher students, and I don't know if this is still the case, but at the time, there were a lot that had sort of caps or unofficial caps on the number of voucher students that they would admit, and those, because they needed to keep many of the middle and upper middle class families there paying the full tuition. They could only afford to have 20%
Well, all right, so they just
low income vouchers, and those were indeed at the time. I know that they've raised the income caps in Wisconsin now, so more people qualify. But at the time, it was very much targeted at the poorest people in Milwaukee.
If Betsy DeVos was able to get some kind of national legislation, and as we speak right now, they're just about to kill most of the ACA in the House, so they do have the ability to make sweeping changes in our national legislative landscape. If they get this, does Illinois or does the city of Chicago have to pass companion legislation? I mean, could they just say that you have to have vouchers?
Well, they're not even really talking about vouchers in the sense that we think of okay, here's your money, you go and take it there. I think they're more talking about it might come in a form of a tax credit, or like this opportunity scholarship where it's not like where charter schools where some of the money from the school district just goes floating over there and the parents don't have any anything to do with it. I mean, it sounds like most of what they're talking about, it comes from the parents to the school and the government money goes to the parent, right? So, but I'm pretty sure that the things that I've read do make it seem as though Illinois or Chicago would not have to pass something, that it's not like a sign-up deal, that it's something that would come via the federal government, like a tax credit, right? I mean, isn't that mostly what
there's the other thing is there are lots of different versions of vouchers. There's tax credits, there's education scholarships, there's these things where, you can create the corporations and people can donate to a fund, and then people can qualify to get money from that fund to use towards educational purposes, which could range from tutoring to actual tuition at a private school. And I think there's so many different ways in which it could go. It could be something like Sarah said, where Illinois and Chicago wouldn't have to do anything. They could also do, frankly, what the Obama administration did is, kind of incentivize states. Say, well, we'll give you X if you don't do it, but we'll give you more if you do it. If you pass a law that expands this and puts some state money and some local money toward school choice and voucher or voucher-like programs.
Now remember, we do have Rauner as governor at the moment, and Meeks is our state board chair. So these are two voucher supporters.
And Meeks he had introduced
voucher
legislation that probably got the farthest or got the most debate in Springfield in recent years.
But I mean, I have a hard time believing that it would pass if it in the current legislature, but who knows? Who knows?
But they might just be they might just have to write a law. They might just have to write like a grant or something. They might not even have to pass anything.
They might not need to go through Madigan and Cullerton. They would just
the most revelatory moment of this program so far has been this thought that had never occurred to me before, that this is driving the charters and the traditional schools kind of into the same column. And I'm just thinking, I'm looking down the road 10 years from now, and maybe they all just merge, and the public schools gets all these nice new buildings and and everybody makes peace.
I always tell people public education's not linear. Like, you don't have people on this side and this side. It's like a big circle. And like at weird places it bends and meets. And there's weird Venn diagrams where they agree and don't agree. And
speaking of that bending and all that, I'm really fascinated by Arnie Duncan coming back to Chicago, and he had this big press event yesterday and was talking about, saying some, what seemed to me to be very sensible things, like there's only maybe 2,000 or 3,000 kids on this registry that the police department has, and of the ones who are most vulnerable to shooting or being shot. And that, how much would it cost to just give these kids jobs? How much would it cost to get people to contribute to? And that seems to be his new role. Is this just PR, or is there something substantive here?
I mean, and Sarah could speak to this a little more than I could probably, but he was doing some of that work when he was superintendent of schools here. I mean, he was one of the first CEOs of CPS that tracked. Is this true? Right? He was one of the first people who tracked and reported how many kids in CPS.
He let the press know.
Yeah,
this
let people know.
Won't tell you how many students have been shot, but
or if they're a student at CPS, they don't confirm. And I mean, to me, it seems like a bit of an extension of returning to a project he felt was unfinished, maybe, or an effort he felt he didn't complete.
Yeah, it does seem like when he went to Washington, one thing that he felt very bad about is that he was leaving Chicago with, this big violence problem and a lot of kids that were sort of out there. But I also have to think that it's not quite as easy as he sort of makes it seem. I mean,
all a job.
Just give them all a job. I mean, even just the idea, if you hear the police say, all right, there's 2,000 people that are in this category. Well, I mean, from just sitting at home, I'm like, well, go get those guys and do them something to do. Right. I mean, come on, this is not rocket science, but it's way more complicated than that.
It is way more complicated than that.
It's not that easy.
But I just found it interesting that he's putting himself out there as being willing to try to tackle this, intractable problem. So anyway, those are those guys. And to finish up, as our dessert, let's talk about Barbara Byrd-Bennett.
Oh, I've been waiting. Thank you. You've been waiting?
We have to talk about Barbara Byrd-Bennett. So, were you there for the sentencing?
I did go.
Did you make eye contact with her?
No, not today.
No?
Not that day. Not that day. She didn't. She was like Lauren was saying, she left that courthouse like I don't think she's ran that fast in years.
Like a minivan pulled up out front. I mean, clearly someone had arranged this to be out there.
I would imagine so.
I mean, she came in at the last minute. She did not come in with all of her family, and then she just hightailed out of there. And after her plea, she did come around into the press pit, and it's not like she took questions, but she made her apology and said her piece, and then left. But this was just
so she'd made her apology. That was enough. Right?
10 minutes of apology.
I bring this up for viewers who may not remember that Sarah's been on the show for many, many years, and I think you're generally credited with being the one who pulled the thread that unraveled the garments.
And then afterwards, I mean, a lot more reporting came out that people should have known before then. I mean, a lot of what Lauren reported and Dan over at the Sun-Times. I mean, there were red flags with Barbara Byrd-Bennett
all over the place, right? Like literally in other cities,
right,
like Detroit, where the FBI was investigating her.
And isn't it crazy? They actually said, this was like a great moment. They said that one of the reasons why they were able to get the emails here in Chicago was because they already had a search warrant on her emails in Detroit. Because of Detroit, the feds already did. Yeah, that's crazy. And also, one thing I keep saying is that I think that there's going to be more to this story.
You do?
I do. I think the Inspector General will come out with something. I think there'll be some other companies implicated in some various ways. I mean, Becky and I did a story about how this one company that runs alternative schools was vendor A in her indictment, and was and they're still getting money in Chicago. They're still around. They're also getting tied up with all the black pastors in the city, who are very politically connected. I think that the point is that she maybe was willing to play ball, and so the other companies that were willing to also play ball.
It's so fascinating to me because when we look back on it, and you know, you always do this kind of thing, right? Where you go back and you sort of lay this layer over your history and what you remember at the time. And I just can't believe how many people were involved with Barbara Byrd-Bennett who never had this, or apparently had no clue that any of this stuff was going on. I mean, I presume the mayor didn't know about this, or you know, high officials didn't know, or they would have, I'm sure they would have moved to have gotten rid of her or something.
And the one guy who did put his hand up, and the judge gave him credit several times along the way, resigned very suddenly. There was a man who was in charge of principal training at CPS called Steve Gehring, who was seen in email asking questions, who at meetings was known to question, and he appeared in a lot of the court filings saying, what is going on here? And all of a sudden, you know, early in the month before the big contract passed, the $20.5 million no big deal passed, he resigned. And the judge came out and basically said what all of us have been thinking, which is, you pushed him out, you fired him.
Yeah.
He had the nerve to ask questions. And the second he did, you made him go away. So then where's the incentive for anybody else to, I don't know.
Interesting.
I don't know, but I still think there are things that City Hall should have known, could have known, would have known, if City Hall really wanted to know
If they wanted to know.
Do you think that in her statement in the court that she was actually alluding to the fact that she deserved this because she closed the 50 schools? She deserved this contract, or that because she did talk about how painful it was to close the 50 schools and how she did that. And then...
Well, and the minute I elbowed you was because she said the mayor made her close the 50 schools.
And I felt like what she was sort of saying is like, listen, I held his bag, he turned a blind eye. I mean, I felt like that's sort of the gist of her statement was, though she didn't connect the dots, and maybe I'm connecting them.
But this was a level of corruption that is embarrassing even by Chicago standards, you know? I mean, in so many ways, there's so much money sloshing around. The meat was really a cooking on this one.
Yes.
Well, I agree with what Sarah's saying, and that I think there's a lot more to this story, and that there are a lot of layers to peel back on not just this one company and this one superintendent, but all of the companies that do business with the school district, and all of the people who go in and out of positions, both inside the school districts that they work with and into the companies that then they go work for. I think there's a lot of that, and I think some of it is, I don't want to like be scary and scare tacticky, but I think that what I saw with this, and what I feel like happens in the world of education with all these companies, feels a lot like when with the banks and the regulators and them going in and out of these revolving doors and taking positions and climbing ladders that require you to bounce between two entities that really ought to be policed better. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in there that Barbara just got caught.
Yeah. Well, as we have said so many times on this show, these are the dark sides of privatization, when you just bring in companies and just trust them to do things and just give them a blank check. These things happen. Wow, this has been an interesting conversation. I'm so glad to have reconvened the group. It's been a lot of fun talking to you. Thanks for being here. And I hope we get to do it again sometime soon, because I have a feeling this story won't go away. We'll have plenty more to talk about. Lauren FitzPatrick, Chicago Sun-Times, in alphabetical order. I'm glad to have you here. Thanks for coming back, and see you again soon. Sarah Karp from WBEZ, Becky Vevea from WBEZ, part of the juggernaut of education reporting at Chicago Public Media. And glad to have you guys all here. Thank you for watching. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a presentation of CAN TV, as you well know. You can see all of our shows by going to this address right here. You can watch this show anytime on demand, this one today. You can listen to us on SoundCloud. You can listen to us on iTunes. And as we say, if you send me an email, I'll come to your house and do the show for you there because we want you to see the show, all right? And we'll see you next week with another program. We're going to talk about mass transit next week. We've got some interesting twists on mass transit and things that are going on with that. So hope you'll join us for that. Thanks. See you next week. Bye-bye.